Mark and Sarah were the kind of couple people noticed not because they were loud or flashy, but because they carried that quiet, magnetic energy of two people completely at ease with each other. July 2001, Death Valley National Park. They had been on the road for a week, a dusty road trip through the Southwest, cameras packed, guidebooks marked with circles and stars, little notes scribbled in the margins. Must see this. Ask Ranger about that. They stopped at Furnace Creek Visitor Center just after noon. Security footage later studied frame by frame shows Sarah adjusting her ponytail, Mark leaning over the counter, maps spread between them. They bought 2 bottles of water, a stack of postcards, a thin pamphlet on Death Valley hiking trails. Mark joked with the ranger about sneaking in one last adventure before the drive home to San Diego. Sarah smiled, half exasperated, half amused. They were last seen walking toward their white SUV, a rental, the sun glaring off the windshield, the heat already rippling off the asphalt. A ranger outside waved to them casually. They waved back. That was it. No one saw them again. In the years that followed, that final moment became legend in Death Valley, a snapshot of 2 young travelers about to step into a story that no one could explain. Sarah's mom would later remember the voicemail. "Hey, just checking in, we're going to do a short hike before we leave, love you." Mark's brother would remember a text. "Man, this place is wild. Never seen anything like it." Normal, ordinary, and then gone. There was no drama, no argument, no sudden storm, no signpost pointing to what was about to happen. Just a couple in love, chasing one more memory in the desert, the same way so many others had done before them. But in Death Valley, one last hike can turn into something else entirely, something the maps don't show, something the guidebooks can't warn you about. Something waiting, just past the edge of where you think it's safe to go. By the time anyone realized Mark and Sarah were missing, the desert had already begun its work. The temperature climbed fast. July in Death Valley isn't just hot, it's record-breaking, bone-drying, breath-stealing heat. That week, the forecasts were alarming even by desert standards. 122 degrees F at Furnace Creek. 126 degrees F near Badwater Basin. Asphalt softening under tires. Air so dry, it stole moisture straight from your skin. Rangers posted warnings at every station. Avoid hiking, carry extra water, stay near main roads. Tourists passed the signs, pausing just long enough to snap photos, a novelty, a brag. Most stayed cautious, some didn't. On July 7th, around 3 p.m., a park employee driving Warm Springs Road saw the white SUV pulled to the side. It was just a quick glimpse, but later she would remember. 2 people outside crouched near the open trunk, maps spread out, Mark's baseball cap shielding his face, Sarah tying her hiking boots. Nobody thought much of it. Couples pull over all the time to check their bearings, to take photos, to cool off before pushing on. By evening, the heat showed no mercy. Temperatures after sundown hovered near 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The desert shimmered gold and violet, a beauty that masked its danger. Back at the visitor center, radios buzzed with small chatter, routine patrols, overheated cars, hikers cutting trips short. No one knew that Mark and Sarah were already hours past where they should have been. The next morning, when they didn't check out of their motel in Beatty, Nevada, the owner figured they'd left early. When Sarah's mom didn't get the promised "we're back on the road" call, she thought maybe they were out of cell service. It would be another 24 hours before anyone began to worry by then. The sun had come and gone twice, and the temperatures had pushed even higher. Death Valley doesn't play by the rules of time. Out there, hours stretch, minutes melt, and once the desert decides to close its hand around you, the clock becomes a cruel joke. The last confirmed sighting of the couple was just another casual afternoon in the park, but by the time the Rangers checked that same stretch of Warm Springs Road, the SUV was gone. And so were they. The notebook was small, leather-bound, worn at the edges. When it was finally recovered, wedged between the passenger seat and the center console, the ink had blurred at the corners, but most of the words survived enough to tell a story no one had expected. Mark had been keeping notes the whole trip. Short, sharp observations, trails they liked, places they ate, funny lines Sarah tossed out while driving, but mixed in with the mundane was something else. A few entries before the last date read, "Local at the gas station said something about a hidden cave near Warm Springs. Old mining spot? Should check it out. Sounds cool." Later. "Found it on an old map, barely marked. Not far from where we're camping. Just a quick look, nothing crazy." The handwriting shifts on the last pages, hurried, messy. "Sarah thinks it's too hot for this. She's probably right. But we're already here, going to check the pass, maybe spot the cave, back before sunset." Locals who were interviewed after the couple vanished told versions of the same thing. Yeah, there were old stories. About a collapsed mining tunnel somewhere off Warm Springs Canyon, the kind that never got marked on tourist maps. Most locals avoided it not out of superstition, but because it was stupid to go poking around in a place that could swallow you. Mark didn't know that. Or maybe he did, but adventure blurred the edges. The idea of finding something secret, something not in the guidebooks, had worked its way under his skin. Sarah, if the notes were right, was more cautious. But sometimes love is compromise. In the end, they walked past the trail markers, down into the maze of gullies and dry washes, following an old mining road barely visible under the sand. It wasn't far, they thought, just over the ridge, just past that next turn. The desert doesn't care what you planned. It only cares what you bring and what you leave behind. A week later, a park ranger flying a search grid spotted it from the air, white glint against bone-colored sand, way off any mapped road, deep in Anvil Canyon. The SUV was half swallowed by drifted dunes, one rear wheel almost entirely buried, the front tires sunk to the axles. From the air, it looked like it had been parked, not crashed. Calm, deliberate. But on the ground, the details painted a more unsettling picture. Doors locked, keys inside, windows rolled up. No footprints leading away, just faint disturbances in the sand that the wind had already half erased. Inside, the car was a time capsule. 2 empty water bottles, a crumpled map marked with a shaky X, a guidebook folded to the remote hiking section, a phone with no signal, and Mark's leather notebook. Sarah's sunglasses were left in the cup holder, one temple snapped clean. There was no sign of a struggle. No sign they had been forced out. No obvious mechanical failure. The gas tank still had fuel. The engine, when tested, turned over without issue. It was as if they had parked, gotten out for a moment, and simply never returned. Rangers combed the area, walking grid lines, scanning with drones, calling out names into the hot stillness. Nothing. No clothes, no gear, no trail. Just the car, as still and silent as the grave. People started to whisper. Maybe they got disoriented, wandered too far. Maybe they fell into one of the narrow side canyons. Maybe the heat had driven them to make a fatal mistake. But some wondered about that cave Mark had written about, if it was out there, if they'd found it, if it had become their tomb. By nightfall, the sand had already begun, its slow reclaiming, softening edges pulling at the tire tracks. In Death Valley, even the searchers knew, the desert gives up its secrets only when it wants to, and sometimes it never does. The search began under a sky so wide it felt like it could swallow you whole. By the time Rangers officially launched the operation, Mark and Sarah had been missing for more than 5 days. That's how it goes out here. People assume delays, missed calls, maybe a last-minute change of plans, until they don't come back. Until a motel owner notices an empty room. Until a rental car company calls asking why their vehicle hasn't been returned. The SUV became ground zero. From there, the teams fanned out. Rangers from Death Valley, search and rescue volunteers from Inyo County, even helicopters flown in from China Lake. Horses were brought in to cover terrain the trucks couldn't reach. They swept canyons and ridges, washes and gulches, shouting their names into the searing emptiness. But it was as if Mark and Sarah had been plucked off the face of the earth. No footprints, no dropped gear, No scraps of clothing snagged on rocks. The sand was an accomplice. Every windstorm erased the traces. Helicopter crews scanned for movement, for heat signatures. Nothing. Searchers worked from sunrise to nightfall. The days were merciless, 110 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes more, the kind of heat that pulls the sweat straight from your body before you even realize you're thirsty. Radios crackled, water bottles emptied. They checked old mining sites, the gullies near Anvil Canyon, the trailheads leading toward Warm Springs. Someone remembered a hiker's report from years back about a cave collapsed near a side canyon. They marked it. They searched it. Nothing. With each passing hour, hope drained a little more. Rangers knew the math. Out here, without water, survival time isn't measured in days, it's measured in hours. But they searched anyway, because sometimes you do it for the families, sometimes you do it because you're stubborn, and sometimes, deep down, you believe the desert might just give someone back if you look hard enough. On the seventh day, Mark's sister, Emily, went on local television. She sat stiff-backed under the studio lights, hair pulled into a nervous ponytail, hands twisting a tissue in her lap. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. "We just want them home," she said softly. "Mark and Sarah, they were experienced hikers. This wasn't reckless. This wasn't just wandering off." She talked about her brother, his love of history, the old books he used to collect, the maps, always the maps. He was fascinated by old mining routes, she said, voice breaking just slightly. He would pore over these old papers he found online, talk about hidden shafts, abandoned tunnels. He wanted to see the places people had forgotten. The public latched onto that detail, a hidden cave, a lost mine. It lit up the forums, the amateur sleuth threads, the campfire stories. The couple hadn't just gotten lost, they had gone looking for something. Searchers took notice too. They pulled old topographical surveys, mining records, ranger reports from decades ago. A few of the veterans muttered under their breath about places best left alone, spots not on any official map, places the desert had claimed long before. Emily's plea rippled outward. News crews arrived. The couple's photos appeared on missing posters, on websites, in the corners of nightly broadcasts. Mark grinning under a baseball cap, Sarah laughing behind oversized sunglasses. And all across the country, people watched and wondered and said the same thing to themselves: how does a couple just vanish? But in Death Valley, it's easier than you think. It didn't take long for the theories to start. In the cafes around Furnace Creek, at gas stations along the highway, on dusty front porches where locals watched the endless sun beat down, everyone had a version. Everyone had a guess. They ran into trouble, one bartender told a reporter, shaking his head grimly. Out here, you get drifters, drug runners, people using these back canyons to move things they don't want seen. Others whispered about foul play, a darker undercurrent. What if someone had been waiting? A hitchhiker they picked up, a stranger at a gas station, a wrong turn into the hands of someone who knew the desert better than they did? And then there were the old-timers shaking their heads at all of it. No mystery, they said. Just heat and pride. Happens every few years. City folks come out here thinking they're tougher than the desert, but the desert wins. Online, the speculation spread like wildfire. Threads popped up overnight. People combed satellite images, old mining maps, Reddit posts, conspiracy blogs. The area near China Lake Naval Weapons Center drew particular attention, an off-limits military site bordering the park. What if they'd stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see? What if they were silenced? For the families, it was torture. Emily stopped reading the comments after the first few days. Sarah's parents didn't go online at all. But the searchers, they heard the noise. And some of them, late at night, wondered if they were missing something. What everyone agreed on was this: people don't just vanish, not completely. But Death Valley has always been a place where things slip away: water, time, trails, memory. Sometimes people too. It wasn't long before someone said the words, Death Valley Germans. In 1996, a family of 4 from Dresden, 2 adults, 2 children vanished in almost the exact same stretch of desert. They were last seen driving a green Plymouth minivan, smiling for photos at tourist spots, buying maps at Furnace Creek. They never made it home. Their abandoned van was found months later, deep in Anvil Canyon, its tires shredded, stuck in sand. For 13 years, no one knew what happened until a pair of hikers, following old clues, found the family's remains scattered across a remote slope. Now, the comparisons were unavoidable. The searchers knew it. So did the locals. So did Emily, who quietly read the old reports in her motel room at night, circling dates and names. Both cases began with a wrong turn. Both had curious, adventurous travelers. Both drew search teams, helicopters, and days of gritting the desert only to turn up nothing. And both were pulled into the orbit of Death Valley's strange history, a place where people chase legends and sometimes become them. The veterans of the 1,996 case weighed in. Some reached out to the Rangers. Others gave interviews, offering cautious advice. Don't assume they went east just because the car faced that way. Check the washes, check south, check the places the maps don't show. One name came up again and again: Tom Mahood, the man who had cracked the German family's case in 2009. People wondered, would he come out here again? Would he see something everyone else had missed? But under all the speculation was something simpler, something colder. The desert doesn't change. People change. People forget. People make the same mistakes. And the desert just waits. The rumor had been around for years longer, maybe, than anyone remembered. A prospector named Alan "Red" McKinley was the first to bring it up to Rangers, his voice low, like he was confessing something. Red had been poking around Death Valley for decades, chasing the last traces of gold fever, wandering trails most people didn't even know existed. "There's a cave out there," he told them, squinting into the sun. "Somewhere near Anvil Canyon. Old mining spot, I think. Sand covered most of the entrance after one of the big windstorms years back. But it's there." The Rangers had heard stories like this before. Everyone had. A lost cave, a buried shaft, a hidden tunnel. Sometimes it was old miners who spoke of it, sometimes hikers, sometimes just desert dreamers sitting at the bar after too many beers. But Red was different. He didn't tell the story for attention. If anything, he seemed reluctant, uneasy. "Never went in myself," he admitted. "Never even found the mouth. But I met a man once, years ago, said he'd stumbled across it barely big enough to squeeze through, just a crack in the rock, mostly covered by sand drifts. Said it opened up inside, wider than you'd expect. Said there were signs someone had been there, left in a hurry." The Rangers noted it, filed it, let it collect dust like so many other local legends. But after Mark and Sarah vanished, Red's words came back, sharper, heavier. Search teams swept Anvil Canyon, marked grids, scanned the walls with drones and climbers, but the desert kept its secrets. No cave appeared, no hidden entrance. Just the same cracked rock, the same dry gulches, the same cruel stretches of emptiness. But for those who knew the terrain, the question lingered. What if Mark had gone looking? What if they'd found it? And what if they'd never come back out? 8 years after Mark and Sarah disappeared, a hiker named Dave Lanning stopped at Butte Valley to rest. Dave wasn't looking for anything special, just a place to pitch his tent, fill his water bottles, and marvel at the way the stars looked, stretched across the sky like silver bones. But near an old mining claim, tucked inside a rusted metal box half buried under rocks, he found something: a map. It was weathered, edges curled, ink faded by sun and time, the kind of thing someone might have sketched in the field, not a formal print. Roads were scribbled in. Some crossed out side canyons labeled with tiny notes: narrow pass, steep climb, watch for loose rock, and near Anvil Canyon, a shaky X. At first, Dave thought it was just someone's old hike plan, but the handwriting was careful, almost obsessive. There were margin notes: possible shaft, collapse, and faintest of all, need to check next trip. He turned it into the Rangers, who passed it along to the search and rescue archives. The connection wasn't immediate. The handwriting didn't match Mark's, and there was no name, no date. But for those who remembered the couple, who remembered Mark's fascination with old mines and hidden places, it was like a whisper from the past. Could this be what he'd been chasing? Rangers debated quietly, behind closed doors. Should they reopen the search? Should they send teams back to the spot marked on the map? Or was it just another dead end in a desert full of them? For now, the map sat in a drawer, sealed in a plastic sleeve, waiting for someone to follow the X. The case had gone cold, packed away like so many others, just names on a report, photos on a bulletin board, a mystery the desert had quietly swallowed. But the map changed that. When the weathered paper turned up at Butte Valley, the tone shifted behind closed doors. Officially, the case was still marked inactive. Publicly, no announcements were made. But inside ranger stations and search and rescue meetings, interest flickered back to life. The X marked a stretch few had searched thoroughly, a remote finger of land near Anvil Canyon, bordered by old mining claims and cut off by dunes and dry washes. Back in 2001, the main searches had focused along the known trails, the likely paths. But this was off-pattern. A small team was assembled quietly. No press, no missing posters resurrected, no cameras hovering at trailheads. Just a few experienced searchers, a couple of rangers who still had the old case files dog-eared on their desks, and a satellite phone. They pored over the topographic maps, comparing them to the hand-drawn version. And the more they looked, the more one thing stood out. If Mark and Sarah had followed this line, they weren't wandering aimlessly. They were trying to reach something. A shaft, a cave, an opening, something no one else had marked. The new search began in the cool of dawn, boots crunching over brittle stone, sun not yet high enough to turn the world into an oven. The air was still heavy with the kind of quiet you only get in places far from roads, far from help. They worked methodically, grid by grid, moving slow, calling out names into the silence. Radios cracked softly as they checked in. From above, the drones swept over the dunes, their cameras scanning the rippled sand for anything out of place. Nothing. But no one turned back. Not yet. Because sometimes, in Death Valley, you only get one more chance. And this time, they weren't alone. When word reached Tom Mahood, he packed his gear without hesitation. Tom was no stranger to this kind of search. In 2009, it had been his obsessive research and off-grid determination that finally cracked the Death Valley Germans case, finding the scattered remains of a family the desert had kept hidden for over a decade. He wasn't a professional investigator. He wasn't law enforcement. He was something else, the kind of person who can't let go. By the time he reached the edge of Anvil Canyon, the dunes were already shimmering with heat. He pulled up old GPS data, compared it to the new hand-drawn map, layered it with satellite images on his laptop. A pattern emerged, thin as thread narrow washes that funneled down toward a single point just beyond the main search grids from 2001. This is where they would have gone, Tom told the team, his voice measured, certain. If they were looking for water, for shade, or for something they believed was there, he led them into the dunes. GPS clipped to his belt, eyes scanning not just the ground, but the shape of the land, how it curved, where it collapsed, where it hinted at something buried. It wasn't a place many had walked before. The sand here was softer, deeper, folding over itself in waves. Boots sank half an inch with every step. The heat pulsed up from the ground in slow, dizzy waves. Hours passed. Then, near dusk, the first glint of something unnatural, a scrap of fabric, faded and half-fused to the earth. Nearby, a faint depression, like the land had once given way, then slowly filled back in. Tom crouched, brushing his hand over the sand. "Here," he said softly. No one spoke, no one moved. Because sometimes the desert doesn't erase everything. Sometimes it leaves just enough for someone stubborn enough, or haunted enough, to find it. It was almost mist. Late afternoon, light slanted low, casting everything in gold, turning the dunes into a shimmering sea. Most of the team had circled back to check gear, sip water, shade their eyes. But Tom lingered, scanning the ground, tracing subtle shifts in color, places where the sand didn't quite lie right. That's when he saw it, a faint glint, no bigger than a coin, half swallowed by the earth. He crouched carefully, heart steady, fingers brushing aside the fine, sun-baked grains. There, tangled among pebbles and bits of dry plant, was a thin metallic band, a bracelet. He lifted it gently, brushing away the sand, turning it over in his hand. On the underside, just faint enough to make his breath hitch, was a single engraved letter. S. Sarah. Tom called over quietly, voice low but cutting through the stillness like a crack of thunder. The team gathered, boots crunching in a wide circle, faces drawn tight. It was delicate, a woman's bracelet, the kind worn every day without thinking, part of skin and habit. They bagged it, marked the GPS point, radioed it in. But what caught Tom's attention more wasn't the bracelet itself. It was where it lay. The sand here held a strange softness, a faint sag, like the earth had once moved or been moved. A subtle dip, barely noticeable unless you were looking, unless you had walked too many miles through places that didn't want to be looked at. He knelt, pressing his palm lightly to the ground. It gave, just slightly. Enough to know something below had once been hollow. And maybe still was. They worked slowly, deliberately, the next morning. No rush, no shovels, just gloved hands brushing at the sand, testing the ground, mapping the delicate skin of the earth. The depression widened the more they studied it, a shallow sink, maybe 6 feet across, just deep enough to catch the wind, to hold the bracelet, to whisper a story no one wanted to hear. Tom lay flat, ear pressed near the surface, tapping softly with his knuckles. The sound came back strange, muted, a dull echo, like tapping over a drum stretched thin with time and dust. "It's a collapse," he murmured, half to himself, half to the others. "Old mining shaft maybe, or a cave." Every step around the edge made the ground shift, just a little. Just enough to remind them. This place had been waiting a long time to be found. The team marked the perimeter, consulted maps, traced old fault lines no longer visible to the eye. They brought in a narrow probe, sliding it carefully into the earth. It dropped farther than expected, brushing through layers of sand, hitting air. There was a pocket below. They set up ropes, cleared gear, kept their voices low. The desert around them held its breath. By dusk, the probe was transmitting clear. Beneath them, maybe 10 feet down, was a hollow space larger than anyone wanted to guess, framed by stone, held together by nothing more than stubborn gravity. Tom stood at the edge, staring into the cracked earth, his face gone pale under the sunburn. They hadn't just been lost. They had been here, all along. They worked as if the earth might shatter. No heavy machines, no hasty shovels, just gloved hands, small trowels, brushes meant for archaeology, not rescue. Every grain of sand lifted was measured, bagged, logged. The desert watched. The sun came up fierce each morning, beat down on their backs, and fell again into a purple bruise across the horizon. But they kept working. They peeled back the sand layer by layer, exposing the mouth of something ancient, the edge of an opening long hidden under drift and collapse. It wasn't much at first. A narrow crack, the frame of a reinforced shaft from some forgotten mining venture, wooden beams rotted through but still clinging to their shape. Bits of rusted wire, old nails, crumbling stone, and the smell faint but distinct of something that had once been alive. Tom stood back often, arms crossed, eyes narrowed not in suspicion but in sorrow. "This is it," he murmured more than once. The deeper they went, the more they saw how the land had swallowed it whole, a rock slide maybe, or a slow caving of the roof over years. The sand did the rest, carried grain by grain on the hot wind, filling every crack, burying every mark, smoothing it all into forgetfulness. At the threshold, they reinforced the ground with timber braces, measuring the stability, testing each step. Inside, the air was cool, unnaturally cool. The kind of chill that clings to places the sun hasn't touched in decades. No one said what they were thinking, but it hung heavy anyway. This wasn't just a cave, it was a tomb. They broke through just after dusk on the third day. A soft collapse, the sand shifting inward with a sigh, not a crash. Enough to open a crawl space, wide enough for a light, wide enough for a person. Tom went first, carefully, slowly. His knees scraped rough against the rock, flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the dark. The air inside was dry as bone, and it smelled of dust, of old stone, and faintly of something human. The beam caught on something pale ahead, cloth, skin. They were there. Two figures side by side huddled close, Mark's arm around Sarah or what remained of them. Their clothes had clung where the desert let them. Skin had dried to leather in the arid cold, hair brittle, faces sunken but faintly traceable. Near them lay the remnants of their packs, a crushed water bottle, the burned-out husk of a flashlight, the notebook, warped but intact, pages curled and yellowed. The last pages told the rest. Stuck, roof caved, trying to wait it out. "Love you, Mom. Love you, Emily." Holding Sarah's hand. Outside, the search team waited, heads bowed, breath held. When Tom emerged, he didn't need to say anything. His face told them all. The desert had kept them, but it hadn't erased them, not completely. It didn't take long for the confirmation to come. In the small, humming lab outside the park, under fluorescent lights too harsh and too clean for the kind of grief they worked beside, the forensic team did their work. Dental records came first: molar fillings, crown patterns, an old fracture on Sarah's incisor from a bike fall years ago, a match. DNA followed. Hair samples, bone scrapings, cross-referenced with family swabs flown in overnight. Another match. Mark and Sarah, gone for 8 years. Hidden under the earth, folded into the desert like a pressed flower, all their searching and wandering ending in this silent, collapsed place. For the families, the news arrived by phone, the kind of call you both dread and crave after so long in limbo. Emily wept when the sheriff called. Sarah's mother hung up halfway through the explanation and just sat in the kitchen, staring at the dark window, unable to move. For the Rangers, it was a quiet moment, heavy but inevitable. Cases don't stay open forever, files need closing. But for Tom, standing on the edge of the site as the last samples were packed up, it felt different. It felt personal. He watched the technicians mark each bag, seal each envelope, and he knew these weren't just remains. They were people. People who had trusted the map, trusted the sky, trusted each other. And somewhere along the way, the desert had taken them. Inside the cave, the story waited. The search team worked gently, lifting each item as if it might break into memory. There was the water bottle, its plastic sun-warped teeth marks faint along the cap. A flashlight, burned out, its casing cracked, switch jammed sideways. A small camera, melted slightly at the edge where the heat had seeped in, its battery corroded to powder. A notebook, Mark's handwriting, shaky near the end, the ink smeared where his thumb had pressed too hard, his words crowding the margins as the pages ran out. They had sheltered. They had waited. There were no signs of panic, no scrambling at the walls, no desperate claw marks at the rocks. Just two people, side by side, rationing their water, waiting for rescue, holding on longer than anyone had a right to. The last pages hit hardest. "We hear wind outside, maybe soon. Stay calm, stay together. I love you, I love you, I love you." Outside, the sand shifted gently in the wind, soft as breath. And the desert, which had kept its secret so long, was finally, almost tenderly, letting go. The notebook was the last thing they retrieved. It had been wedged under a small rock near where they found the bodies, as if Mark had placed it carefully. Or maybe it had slipped from his hand in the final hours. The cover was stiff with age, corners softened by moisture. But when the forensic team eased it open, the pages inside held. The early entries were practical: distances, temperatures, rough sketches of the landscape, notes on the map they were following. Little things meant for later reminders to himself, or maybe for Sarah, or maybe just the habit of a man who liked to leave a trail of his thoughts. But toward the end, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew looser, uneven. Words crowded the lines, rushed, as if time itself had begun to fray. Cave in. Sand came down. Checking exit again in morning. Rations okay. Sarah sleeping. Need to stay calm. Waiting for nightfall. Air cooler. Maybe we can dig. And then, stay strong, Sarah. Stay strong, Sarah. Stay strong, Sarah. The last page was nothing but her name, written over and over, the ink pressed so hard it cut into the paper, the desperate echo of someone holding on, someone trying to believe they could still reach morning. When the notebook was shown to Emily, she closed it quietly after reading just a few pages. She didn't need to see more. She already knew who her brother was. She already knew how he would have faced the dark. The search team placed the notebook into evidence, but no one spoke of it like a piece of evidence. They spoke of it like a voice. And it said only this: we tried, we waited, we stayed together. The analysis came back with brutal clarity. Geologists reviewed the site, tracing the fractures, studying the collapsed stone. It wasn't a sudden disaster, not the kind of thing you could hear coming, run from, dodge at the last second. It was slow, almost invisible. The entrance had narrowed over years, wind and sand pulling it tighter. When Mark and Sarah slipped inside, they had passed through a throat of earth already near breaking. Some time after they entered, maybe hours, maybe minutes, the last support gave way. A roof of soft stone, heavy with sand, slumped inward. Not enough to thunder shut, just enough to seal. On the surface, the depression barely registered. To anyone outside, it looked like another sag in the land, another drift. But inside, it meant everything. The pocket where they were trapped had held longer than it should have, dry air preserving their bodies, their belongings, their final hours. But it was sealed airtight. They tried. The marks were faint, but they're tested rocks, dug with hands, measured attempts, not wild panic. They rationed their water, marked the days. They wrote notes, maybe hoping a rescuer would find them, maybe just to keep themselves from unraveling. But they couldn't dig out. The analysis confirmed what no one wanted to say aloud. They had been alive for days, maybe longer, long enough to wait for nightfall, to whisper comfort, to still believe someone might come. In the end, they hadn't been reckless, or foolish, or lost. They had been unlucky. Unlucky in a desert that does not forgive. The questions came fast once the news broke. Not just how they died, or why they were there, but the most haunting one. Could they have been saved? It didn't take long for the stories to resurface. A pair of hikers, passing through Anvil Canyon in the spring of 2002, had filed a casual note in the visitor log at Furnace Creek. Something about hearing faint voices. At the time, it was written off. We were near the old mining routes, late afternoon, one of them recalled in an old email thread dug up by reporters. Heard something on the wind, high-pitched, maybe a woman. Maybe just the sound of the gusts through the rocks. You hear things out there, you always hear things out there. Another hiker, a solo backpacker, remembered camping near Butte Valley that same season and noting in his journal a strange echo at dusk, like someone calling, faintly, far off. He thought it was another hiker, or maybe just his own nerves. At the time, none of it seemed worth mentioning. But now, it clung to the edge of every conversation like smoke. Had Mark and Sarah been alive, just below the surface, waiting, hoping? Had their calls drifted up through a seam in the earth, carried by the desert wind, brushed past the ears of those who paused and listened, and then kept walking? The rangers cautioned against drawing conclusions. The distances, the acoustics out there, it's easy to imagine things, one said. But off record, some wondered. And for the families, it was the hardest thought to bear. Not just that they had been lost, but that maybe, just maybe, someone had almost found them. The press releases came quietly, without podiums or cameras. Emily's statement was brief. She thanked the searchers, especially Tom, by name. She thanked the rangers, the forensic teams, the volunteers, and then, in the final line, she wrote, We always believed they were together, and they were. Sarah's parents released a letter through their pastor, handwritten, shaky in parts. They spoke of their daughter's love for adventure, her laughter, the way she could turn any small thing, a road trip, a roadside diner, a quiet walk, into something magical. "We never stopped waiting," they wrote. "Now we know where she is." Closure is a strange word, and it settled heavy in the mouths of those left behind. Some called it relief, some called it heartbreak. For 8 years they had lived in the hollow space of not knowing, filling it with hope, or anger, or silence. Now that space was filled not with answers, but with finality. And that was its own kind of grief. In Death Valley, the sun rose over the dunes the next morning like it always did, golden and vast and indifferent. The same place that had taken Mark and Sarah, the same place that had hidden them so long, now watched as their family stepped into the slow, painful light of knowing. The quiet didn't last. Within days, the news broke beyond the desert. First local stations, then national headlines, then a ripple through online spaces where missing persons cases live in a strange, half-lit corner of the internet. Couple found after 8 years in Death Valley. Mark and Sarah, lost adventurers or something more. Cave collapse mystery. Could they have been saved? Reporters swarmed the park. They filmed near Anvil Canyon, though rangers pushed them back from the actual site. Helicopters hovered overhead for wide shots of the shimmering dunes, the cracked earth, the nothingness that had swallowed 2 lives whole. Theories flared up again, almost instantly. Was it really an accident? Some anchors raised questions on air. Why hadn't they turned back? Why had they chosen a dangerous, unmapped route? Were they chasing something or running from something? Online, the speculation spiraled. Hidden treasure, secret military tests, a survivalist stunt gone wrong. And then there were the darker corners, whispers that maybe they'd been lured, maybe they'd been met by someone out there, maybe the cave-in wasn't entirely natural. For the searchers, for the families, it was agony. Emily declined interviews. Sarah's parents stopped answering the phone. Tom Mahood, whose quiet persistence had finally led to the discovery, released a short, measured statement. "There's no conspiracy here. Just 2 people who took a wrong turn in a place that punishes wrong turns. Let's not turn their story into anything less or anything more than what it was." But even he knew, stories like this don't just fade. Especially not when a map with an X sits at the center. It took another week before the man stepped forward. His name was Paul Crenshaw, a retired geologist, thin and sun-leathered, with hands that still bore the rough marks of field work. He had been the one to leave the map in the old metal box near Butte Valley, the one Dave Lanning found and turned over to rangers. Paul hadn't drawn the X lightly. Years before, he'd crisscrossed the area, tracing old mining reports, following rumors of shafts and collapsed tunnels. He'd seen the depression near Anvil Canyon, noted the way the land slumped, how the sand behaved oddly there. "I always meant to report it," he admitted softly to reporters, eyes downcast. "But I told myself no one would be out there." When the map resurfaced, when the search reignited, Paul felt his stomach twist. He knew. Deep down, he'd known for years that something was wrong in that place. "I just thought it was an old shaft," he said. "I didn't think it was people." He paused, voice cracking faintly. "I wish I'd said something." The media latched onto his regret, painting him as a near hero or a near villain, depending on the headline. But those closest to the case understood. Paul wasn't a villain. He was just another person who'd been haunted by the desert and too late had learned the cost of silence. The cave, as it turned out, had a name once. Historians traced it back to a mining claim filed in 1931, the Beckett Shaft, part of a short-lived gold operation that barely lasted 2 seasons before folding under heat, cost, and disappointment. The paperwork survived in crumbling county archives, yellowed sheets listing supply orders, a handful of faded payroll notes, and one thin line in an old ledger. Seized operations due to instability. It was never meant to be found again. Locals remembered bits and pieces. An old-timer recalled his grandfather talking about a hole you didn't go near, A surveyor in the 1970s marked it on a topographical draft but left it blank, deeming it insignificant, collapsed. By the time Mark and Sarah arrived in 2001, the place had been reduced to little more than a dent in the landscape, a whisper in the rock, a ghost of purpose long erased by sand. The more the historians dug, the clearer the picture became. The shaft hadn't been reinforced in nearly a century. The wooden braces they found near the collapse were rotten through, no more able to hold weight than dried twigs. The sands, always restless, had piled, shifted, slumped. The desert does not care about history, but it holds on to it anyway. It holds the stories in its bones, until some wandering pair, a young couple, eager for adventure, stumbles upon them, not knowing that the land underfoot is not just desert, but a graveyard. And sometimes, it takes decades for anyone to remember. Ranger Bill Harmon had been in Death Valley for 30 years. When reporters asked for comment, they expected facts, search procedures, safety warnings, a tidy summary of the recovery. But what they got, sitting on a weathered bench outside the Furnace Creek station, was something quieter. "I've seen people walk into this park full of life," Bill said, eyes fixed on the far-off dunes. "And I've seen people who never walked back out." He talked about the calls that come in, the worried families, the notes on dashboards, the footprints leading nowhere. "You don't understand how big this place is until you try to look for someone in it." He paused, running a hand over his face. "You think you're just looking for bodies, but really, you're carrying their stories. All of them. The ones you find, the ones you don't." Mark and Sarah weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. The desert had claimed solo hikers, lost tourists, families who made a wrong turn and ran out of water. "You try not to carry it home with you," Bill said, voice lower now. "But you do." He glanced at the horizon, where the sky pressed into the earth, blue fading to gold, the line so sharp it almost hurt to look at. "I love this place," he said softly. "But sometimes I think it remembers every name we can't." It didn't take long for the story to drift from fact to folklore. Around campfires in Death Valley, under skies split wide with stars, people began to tell it, the tale of Mark and Sarah, the lovers in the sand cave. The details softened, blurred. In some versions, they were honeymooners. In others, they were newly engaged. Sometimes they were called treasure hunters, sometimes just dreamers who vanished into the dunes. The ending, always, was the same. They had gone looking for something hidden, and they had been swallowed by the earth. Visitors asked rangers where it had happened, snapping photos near Anvil Canyon, standing at the trailheads where the searchers once gathered. Guides mentioned it quietly on tours, glancing toward the horizon, letting the silence fill the gaps no one wanted to name. The cave, the X on the map, the final notes in the notebook all became part of the desert's long, rattling chain of stories. Another chapter layered over the old mining myths, the tales of the Death Valley Germans, the strange echoes people swore they heard at night. For the locals, it was less a ghost story and more a reminder. The desert doesn't need monsters. It has time, distance, heat, silence. That's enough. And in the end, people don't just remember the facts, they remember the feeling. The hush that falls when someone says, "Did you hear about the couple who," and you realize, even in the retelling, something about it still hurts. The investigative reports were clear, clinical, almost cruel in their precision. First, the map, a stitched-together printout, part official trail, part old mining routes found online. It showed paths that no longer existed, roads erased by time and weather, marked with an optimism that only existed on paper. Second, the timing. They went in late afternoon, when the sun still scorched, but shadows tricked the eyes, making distances seem shorter, slopes seem manageable, escape seem easy. Third, the confidence. Mark's notes revealed someone determined, curious, eager to push just a little further. Sarah's voice was in there too, gentle caution, but they were a team, trusting each other, believing they'd know when to turn back. But in Death Valley, small mistakes don't stay small. They compound. The collapse itself might have happened behind them, or above them, or just after they slipped inside. A matter of minutes, maybe even seconds, turning an exploration into a trap. There were no wild errors, no glaring acts of recklessness. Just the kind of slow, quiet stacking of wrong choices that, in the desert, costs everything. The final report ended with a single line, meant to summarize the risk. A combination of environmental factors and human misjudgment led to an unrecoverable situation. But anyone who read between the lines could see it said something simpler. They were human. And out here, sometimes that's all it takes. They placed the plaque quietly. No ceremony, no speeches, no crowds. Just a few rangers, a small crew, and a simple metal marker sunk into the hardpan near the cave entrance. It read, "In memory of Mark and Sarah, lost July 2001, found October 2009. Forever part of this place." The wording had taken days to agree on. How do you sum up 8 years of waiting, the weight of a family's grief, the hush of a searcher's steps, the soft collapse of time itself? In the end, they kept it small, almost spare. The plaque wasn't meant for tourists or headlines. It was for those who knew, for the families who might return someday, for the rangers who walked this land every day, for the rare hiker who stumbled close and paused long enough to read. Emily came once, months later, when the winter sun was low and the desert was cool, quiet. She stood there alone, hand brushing the metal, eyes closed. She left a small rock on top, pale and smooth, the kind you carry in a pocket without knowing why. The cave entrance remained sealed, a scar in the earth, slumped under sand and stone. No one planned to reopen it. There was no need. The desert had taken what it wanted. And now, at least, it had given back just enough. The plaque caught the light at certain angles, flickering gold, then silver, then soft gray. Like a memory, too stubborn to disappear, too faint to fully hold. In the end, Death Valley kept most of its secrets. For every Mark and Sarah found, there were others still out there, names tucked into old missing reports, faces on faded posters, footprints long ago swallowed by the dunes. Why are some stories recovered while others stay buried? Maybe it's chance. Maybe it's stubborn searchers and half-lucky maps. Maybe it's just timing, the way the desert shifts, loosens its grip, offers up a bone, a buckle, a bracelet, a whisper. Or maybe it's simpler. The desert only gives what it's willing to let go. It has no malice, no hunger, just vastness, heat, time. And in that vastness people come and go, hoping, testing, wandering, sometimes vanishing. The desert watches, it waits. And in the end, it always wins. Not with violence, not even with cruelty, but with patience. The kind of patience that outlasts hope, that wears down stone, that folds names and stories into itself until they are part of the land, part of the wind, part of the silence. Mark and Sarah's story ends here, but the desert's story doesn't. It keeps going, as it always has, as it always will. A place where beauty and danger live side by side. A place where some come to find themselves and some are never found at all. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.